Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the esteemed panelists for joining me, Tracy Reynolds, a co-chair of the Space Law Interest Group at the American Society of International Law, on this, the second episode of an overarching event that the Space Law Interest Group is calling Empire, Star Wars, or Utopia, Star Trek, the Predictive Power of History, Policy, and Pop Culture. This is episode 2, Perfidy in Space. Do Klingons follow the Geneva Conventions? I have with me today Thomas Harper. He works at the Office of the General Counsel for the American Red Cross National Headquarters, and he's a specialist in international humanitarian law. I've also got with me today Michelle Hanlon. She, among her many accolades, is an instructor at the University of Mississippi School of Law. She is also a director for that School of Law's Center for Air and Space Law. Samantha Cheyenne will be joining us in a few minutes. She is a former Clara Barton International Humanitarian Law Fellow with the American Red Cross National Headquarters. I do encourage everyone who is enjoying this today to check out their bios and their experiences through LinkedIn or some other social media platform, because they truly are exceptional panelists with deep expertise in this area, and we're very lucky to have them today. I'm going to start just by presenting it to you all by sharing my screen. So thank you for your patience as I work through that. I am getting errors here, unfortunately. How is that? Is that working for everyone?
Looks good.
Great. Let's go to the first slide here. Now, the overall premise that we have today is that we can turn to vignettes from TV shows, movies, or even our own imaginations to try to extrapolate how law would work in outer space. Sometimes people talk about how there needs to be a new legal regime that's developed in outer space, but this series postulates that there is sufficient law. We just have to think about how to creatively apply it. And also, we can turn to pop culture in the absence of state practice, which is what we would normally analyze for customary international law, where states are acting out of a sense of legal obligation in their interactions, or we would turn to international jurisprudence. And of course, with outer space, we don't have either of those things. So I present to you Star Trek Discovery, episode Battle of the Binary Stars. And what you see now on your screen is a Star Trek admiral in blue and gold asking for a ceasefire from a Klingon admiral so that they can have a conversation about resolving a conflict without resorting to force. The Klingons agree. But as we see in this episode, their agreement was simply a cover for an attack. The pictures that you see, which are all screen grabs from the episode itself, shows in green the Klingon vessel uncloaking, so they were there secretly, unobservable by any sensors that were on the Star Trek vessel, and then crashing into a Star Trek Federation ship and killing everyone on board. Now, what happens next? Well, the starship that was there that had called for help that belongs to the Federation, which is also staffed by Star Trek officers, decides that they will capture the Klingon admiral. And to do that, they take a missile warhead, that's that round thing that you see in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. They activate it, as you can see in the lower left quadrant with that red bar, and then they transport it into the body of a dead Klingon warrior. You see those green lines? Those are transporter beams. And so the Klingon warship is transporting their dead into their warship. And that bomb goes off, and that allows the Star Trek officers to sneak aboard the Klingon ship and try to capture the Klingon admiral. So what do we have here? We have hiding bombs and dead bodies, and it works. What you see on this particular screen is the Klingon vessel getting blown to pieces. And you can see little gold dots of debris. The Star Trek officers hide in the debris and get on board the Klingon vessel. And then they try to kidnap the Klingon admiral. And for those of you who are now suddenly fascinated with Star Trek Discovery and want to go out and watch the episode, I won't spoil it for you on what happens. But, I'm a lawyer. I'm an active duty Navy military attorney. So my thought was, well, what law would apply here? So that's what I'll talk to you about for another couple of minutes before I turn it over to my esteemed panelists for their thoughts on the matter. So I am going to stop screen sharing and just talk to you a bit about international law as it would be applicable in an instance such as this one. Now, let's pretend that this is an international armed conflict between Americans in outer space and some other state, or perhaps our own version of Klingons when they find us here on planet Earth. Now, an event such as what you just saw has been prohibited in customary international law. That is, using a trick to force or convince an enemy to act in a way to your advantage. What you just saw as perfidy is considered by many nation states to be a piece of customary international law, that we don't act that way. The Lieber Code, the Oxford Manual, the Hague Relations, ICRC Rule number 65, they all talk about perfidy and how it is not appropriate and unlawful in an international armed conflict. We see it in Additional Protocol 1. And even the statute of the International Criminal Court says that killing or wounding treacherously a combatant adversary is a war crime. And there are many military manuals that specifically bar perfidy in international armed conflicts, including Sweden and the UK. Now, what does the United States think about this? Well, the U.S. Department of Defense Law of War Manual includes honor as one of the principles that active duty military participants abide by, whether it's an international or a non-international armed conflict. And honor demands that there's a certain amount of fairness in offense and defense and a certain mutual respect between opposing military forces. So that includes the fact that enemies must deal with one another in good faith in their non-hostile relations, and that honor and good faith prohibits killing or wounding enemy persons by resort to perfidy. Now, please note that Additional Protocol 1, Article 37 particularly, prohibits capture by resort to perfidy. So, my back of the napkin calculations as an active duty military legal practitioner is that what Starfleet did would be a violation of Additional Protocol 1, Article 37, because they got on board the Klingon vessel. They were able to attempt to kidnap this Klingon admiral through perfidy. Now, the Department of Defense hasn't interpreted customary international law to prohibit U.S. forces from seeking to capture by resort to perfidy, but I think that would be an interesting question for practitioners to discuss. Non-international armed conflicts do not have perfidy as part of Additional Protocol 2, but again, the statute for the International Criminal Court does say killing or wounding treacherously constitutes a war crime in a non-international armed conflict as well. So that's enough for me. I am super excited to hear what Michelle and Thomas have to say. And if it's okay with my esteemed panelists, I would like to turn it over to Michelle Hanlon for her take on perfidy in space. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Tracy. I'm so thrilled to be here. And I have to say, the timing of this, when we were talking about this, the world was one way and now it's a very different way. And I was thinking as I was rewatching last night, The Wounded, Season 4, Episode 12 of The Next Generation, I had sort of one screen with Star Trek and one screen with Israel, sort of thinking, okay, how am I going to sort of put all this together? And so, what I want to go back and to think about perfidy, because of course, when we're in the Star Trek universe, we're not talking just about humans, right? And it was Neil Armstrong who said, technology is great, but will humans ever be able to overcome their own character? And this is something he sort of put out there. So the Star Trek universe seems to believe that perfidy, treachery, is not just a human character flaw, right? So, when I was looking at this episode, I was thinking, does Picard give us hope? Or is it Worf who, in the early portion of the episode, angrily points out that trust is earned, not given away? And what does that mean? And that was sort of what I was thinking, because I think in many ways, perfidy is a natural survival instinct. right? So I don't think it's a human character flaw. I think any being that has sort of a concept of self would not feel above treachery to save themselves. So I want to just go through quickly because this was the episode The Wounded. Picard comes to learn that a Starfleet ship has attacked an unarmed Cardassian science station that sits in a very strategic location that's sort of straddled three different very important Federation sectors. So this came just 1 year after a peace treaty settled a, quote, long conflict between Starfleet and the Cardassians. I note as a lawyer, I never got to see the treaty, so I'm operating blind in my interpretation of it. But it's quickly discovered that the fatal attack was perpetrated by Ben Maxwell, captain of the starship Phoenix. In an incredible act of trust and goodwill, the Enterprise takes 3 Cardassians on board as they make their efforts to find Phoenix and make contact with it. During the chase, the Phoenix destroys 2 more Cardassian vessels, a destroyer and a supply ship, so the loss of life is extreme in the multiple hundreds. It turns out that Captain Maxwell of the Phoenix lost his entire family during a Cardassian raid that wiped out more than 100 civilians. So we have this captain sort of with a ticket for vengeance or revenge. In discussing the incident on board, a Cardassian noted that they had been told that the site where they conducted the attack was going to be a launching pad for an attack on the Cardassians themselves. So again, it's very easy to consider that Captain Maxwell's judgment was clouded by the loss of his family. Maxwell urged Picard to board the Cardassian supply vessel to prove to him that this was actually not a civilian science station, but a plan for a staging area for an attack. Picard refuses. And he says, what the Cardassians have or have not done is irrelevant. This must be handled by Starfleet. To which Maxwell does the classic, oh, they take so long, diplomats, who has that kind of time? And among other things, Maxwell argued that the Cardassians live to make war. And this they raised a really interesting question for me of whether warriors can find roles for themselves in peace, and it's sort of, again, sort of thinking about how that impacts our lives here. So, of course, the final twist, and I am going to give it away, sorry, suggests that Maxwell was right all along and that this was indeed, a staging area for attack. And Picard says, I was here to protect the peace. Lasting peace begins with us. So, when I was looking at this and thinking about peace, you need a peace to protect, which is why we have the law, right? That's why we have a treaty, a binding treaty. But you also need the people with the will to protect that peace. And here we had Picard and his Cardassian counterpart, Gul Macet. And those two seemed sort of intent on keeping the peace. But how often does that happen? How often will we get these sort of noble beings who will sort of think, okay, we are here to protect the peace, we're going to do that. So then I looked at the law and found, okay, let's think. Was this anticipatory self-defense? Well, that requires imminence. And the fact of this scenario suggests that this was a station building up to a military action, but it didn't say that the military action was imminent, that it was coming. So yes, Maxwell, you should have waited and gone to Starfleet and shared the information. But both the actions, those by the Cardassians and by Maxwell, can be seen as perfidy. The treaty was intended to prevent both actions, so is it really right to blame Maxwell? And here is the role of the law. And I was on a webinar this morning with one of my mentors, Ram Jakku, and he said, law without ethics is soulless control. Ethics without law is fiction. So where are we on the spectrum here, right? Absent the treaty under LOAC, there is an argument that this was an acceptable action. So does the treachery by the treaty? Again, Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, Article 26, every treaty in force is binding upon the parties to it and must be performed by them in good faith. Obviously not good faith here if you're building up your military strategy. Article 60 says a material breach of a bilateral treaty by one of the parties entitles the other to invoke the breach as a ground for terminating the treaty or suspending its operation in whole or in part. So, whoops, Maxwell, violation of the treaty doesn't mean you can attack. It means you have to go and formally announce that you are withdrawing from the treaty, and then you can attack, presumably. Of course, a material breach includes a violation of a provision essential to the accomplishment of the object or purpose of the treaty, which we have here. And again, even then, we have that notice requirement. So all in, this was really perfidy for sure, but could have been saved had Maxwell had a little bit of patience, gone back. But again, what we don't know from this scenario is how truly imminent this potential attack on these 3 areas of the Federation was. But again, my entire take on this discussion that we're having on perfidy is that it really is a survival instinct, and the law can help us protect against that instinct, but only so far. And so I'd leave you and go to my fellow panelists with this idea that lasting peace begins with us, and how many people really have the strength and the willpower to be the us. Thank you.
Michelle, that was awesome. Thank you so much for the preparation that you put into this and your comments. Part of what I didn't share about the Star Trek Discovery episode, background-wise, is that there is a Starfleet officer who is positive that the Klingons are going to act in the way that they ultimately did. And she ends up going to court-martial because she took control of the bridge, but she was right. And so I think that's really interesting, getting to that survival instinct and how hopefully law can help show good faith in a way that it's infused with those ethical principles that will help us be better versions of ourselves. So thank you for that. And Thomas, turning it over to you.
This is your biggest mistake of the whole day, is turning it over with a Star Trek focus to a Star Wars fan. I'll make you regret inviting me, and you can return it back to the Federation's galaxy when I'm done, I suppose. But hi, everyone. Tracy, thanks to you and to ASOL and the Space Law Interest Group for inviting me out. As Tracy said off the top, I'm the senior legal advisor, senior counsel in international humanitarian law for the American Red Cross. And in that capacity, I run our IHL dissemination program. And we carry out the nation's mandate to disseminate IHL to the American public, a mandate that's found both in the statutes for the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, but also a mandate that stems from the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. So with that background, I want to take us out of the Federation Star Trek galaxy and launch us into my warm comfort blanket. And I say that as a Star Trek fan who grew up watching Voyager every single week, fully believing as a kid that they were going to find Earth in that episode and having no understanding of network television and how that all works. But I think that Star Wars and the thesis that I'm going to propose here meshes in very nicely with this, the conversation so far. And so Star Wars, if nothing else, is pretty much exactly predictive of where we're going. I mean, we're going to have lightsabers in the near future. I assume that, and my background is as an Army JAG officer, these will be standard issue to officers. So I look forward to choosing my color. We're obviously going to have X-Wings and Y-Wings and TIE fighters. That will be the ship of choice, so the Air Force can get ready for that. Everyone will have a Baby Yoda or Grogu in their household, so set aside your poodle mixes, because this is the pet of the future. Force abilities may or may not come standard. And it's also a galaxy and a film franchise, quite frankly, now significantly invested in television as well, that has anchor points in the rule of law. These legal concepts come up again and again over the course of the movies and the television shows. And Star Wars is a lot of things. It's not subtle with a lot of the lessons that it tries to impart. Quite the opposite. So by the end of this, especially the Star Trek fans, you are all going to be Han Solo here, and I will be C-3PO, the professor, and I do have an off switch. I will be talking spoilers specifically for the television show Andor. So if you haven't seen Andor, just be prepared to have a little bit spoiled. I'm not going to spoil the whole first season, but we will get into some spoilers for a few of the episodes in the first season. So we're talking perfidy here. We're talking the rule of law, the existence or lack thereof of laws of armed conflict, IHL, in space, and where can we look to? And I would submit to you that the Rebel Alliance, so the good guy group that underpins and is fighting the galactic civil war that makes up the original trilogy, is a great example of the importance of IHL, the importance of LOAC in space, and a great example of some key lessons that can be learned in terms of the existence or lack thereof of state practice. And so my short thesis here is that in light, or despite everything that the Empire does, and we'll get into a little bit of that here in a second, but all their nefarious deeds, the rule of law, and specifically IHL and LOAC, matter very much to one group in the Star Wars galaxy, and that is the Rebel Alliance. In fact, I would argue that adherence to IHL, even in the absence of formal international or intergalactic treaties, is perhaps the single most important aspect of what they are trying to accomplish in throwing off the yoke of the Galactic Empire. So with that, I want to dial us into a recent TV show. So Andor is absolutely phenomenal. If you haven't seen it, it's okay. I'm going to catch you up in a real quick sort of Star Wars history minute on the background for my analysis here. If you haven't seen Andor, I highly, highly recommend it. This is my favorite piece of Star Wars content outside of Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. It is exquisite. And I want to use Andor as a frame of reference for discussing sort of the existence of a semblance of state practice, or some, I use the Geneva Conventions here just as common parlance, but the existence of these rules of armed conflict and their importance through the framework of Star Wars. And I think there's a great connection point to the points that have already been raised in Star Trek, and we'll talk about that in a second. So for Andor, think Rogue One. If you haven't seen that movie, 2016 Star Wars film about the effort to steal the Death Star plans. And you have here on the left side Cassian Andor. So he's a member of the Rebel Alliance intelligence. Well, they decided to make a TV show about his backstory. So Andor is all about Andor, Cassian Andor, before he joins the rebellion. In fact, before the rebellion as we know it as Star Wars fans exists. So this show is set 5 years before the events of A New Hope. The Empire is at the absolute height of its power. It is unchecked. It is unrivaled across the galaxy. And that sort of grip that Leia talks about in A New Hope, that's sort of tightly around the throat of the galaxy, is perhaps at its strongest point as this first season kicks off here. So they rule with an ironclad fist. There is no rebellion. In fact, the first season sort of tells the story of the nascent rebellion, because there is no alliance. There's no formal gathering or joint venture of insurgent groups. There's a lot of independent efforts, insurgent efforts led by people like Luthen Rael up there on the left, and Saul Guerrero's partisan forces. And then there are sort of rebellious, little r rebellious political movements as well, involving folks like Senator Mon Mothma from Chandrila there on the bottom. But these forces start to culminate in Andor, and they all come together early in the first season on a planet called Aldhani. Now we've never seen Aldhani on screen before, but we know a few things about Aldhani. It houses, perhaps as its single most important feature, an Imperial garrison there, known as creatively Imperial Garrison Aldhani. Star Wars is great at naming things after the planet that they're on, and also great at crafting entire planets around a single weather feature, a single geographic feature. But Aldhani looks suspiciously like Scotland. It also has, in addition to a garrison, an air command that provides air support to the soldiers stationed there. And the rebels, as it were, I say rebels with a little r because there is no alliance, but an insurgent group has sent a small team of 7, including Cassian Andor, onto the planet on a long-term infiltration mission to get into the garrison. And their target is this boatload of money located at the garrison vault. So this is the payroll for an entire sector of the galaxy, money that the sort of nascent rebellion needs to fuel its efforts against the Empire. The insurgent group goes undercover. They infiltrate the garrison under the cover of this amazing celestial event called the Eye of Aldhani, where the planet is actually passing through a crystal belt in the galaxy. It's quite the light show and provides a nice bit of cover. And they conduct a heist, and spoiler alert, they make it out of there under the cover of this celestial event with the payroll and sort of the garrison smoking in ruins in their wake. The key twist here, and what I want to focus in for Perfidy's sake, is that this isn't a walk in and grab the cash operation. The key to this whole operation is that the holder of the access to the vault, and that's Commander Biaz here, he has the best British name ever. J-Hold is his first name, but they need the commander's access to get into that vault and steal all the credits. And so behind all of this, one of the members of the group, a man by the name of Nemik, seen there on the right, he's a young rebel, but he's written this manifesto, which is called The Trail of Political Consciousness. And he's writing about the course of the rebellion and the roots. Why does it exist? And I want to highlight this quote here, which is really poignant. So he says, the imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. He says, tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks, it leaks, authority is brittle, and oppression is the mark of fear. So they are launching this mission with the backdrop of a galactic empire that is no holds barred. They have their proverbial boot heel on the neck of the galaxy. That is shown not in explicit detail, but it's shown even here on Aldhani, where the Empire has really subjected and is conducting sort of a soft genocide, if you will, of the native Aldhani people, relegating them to some outskirts, really undercutting their religious beliefs, taking their land, and slowly wiping out that culture. That is being replicated across the galaxy as the galaxy just sort of gets used to being oppressed by the Empire in various forms. Now, he also says a point that's going to provide the backdrop for how they carry out this mission. And Nemik says the Empire, that should say, has no moral boundaries. And he questions, why should they not take hold of every chance they have and to let the Empire see how an insurgency adapts? So what Nemik is talking about here is the absence, the vacuum of the rule of law, or the adherence to the rule of law by a major state power, really the only state power, if we think about the Galactic Empire as sort of the single ruling body of all these independent planets. So the planets would be analogous to perhaps a province or a state in our world. But as a whole, that government, that military might that the Empire wields, they do it without any regard to rules or restraint. And makes sense, right? The Empire is ruled by this religious fanatic in a hood who shoots lightning out of his hands, Emperor Palpatine. He's not really the best example of a moral compass or right or wrong, or how not to murder people. He is sort of the poster child of Star Wars dictatorship, right? And this is the same Empire that just 5 years later is going to finish construction on the Death Star and unleash its super weapon power on a peaceful planet, destroying Alderaan in the process in A New Hope. So what Nemik is saying makes sense, and Cassian puts a fine point on it in response. He says the Empire doesn't play by the rules. uniforms. They don't care enough to learn. They don't have to. You mean nothing to them. And that really beautifully articulates this struggle that has existed since A New Hope came out in 1977. Star Wars in the original trilogy presented the conflict between the Empire and the Rebellion in a really classical black and white nature. You had the big bad Empire and the White Knights of the Rebel Alliance, these scrappy upstarts coming together to bring down the bad guys and then have a medal ceremony at the end. Andor adds a lot of color to that. And that comes down to not just saying or pointing out, maybe more eloquently than in A New Hope, that the Empire is bad and they don't follow rules, but it illustrates the tension point that exists when you operate in that sort of environment. So an environment with a powerful state government with extensive military means that has no intention to ever follow or abide by any sort of actual written rules, so no galactic treaties. We know those sort of things exist in the Star Wars world, the sort of equivalent to the Geneva Conventions. Those exist, but they're ignored. That's not present in any imperial training for its troops, and it's not present in any semblance of state practice, to include state practice as it relates even to sort of really powerful, influential worlds. You don't destroy a core planet. I say core planet, core in the galaxy, a very influential planet full of very wealthy and influential galactic citizens like Alderaan, if you have an intent to have even a semblance of state practice that adheres to some aspect of IHL. So this Aldani infiltration team goes in with that backdrop, and they decide to don Imperial uniforms to do so. They go in and they don't just walk into the vault, capture the commander, and make off with the money. They actually take hostages, and not just Imperial troops as hostages. They take the commander's son and his wife, who are stationed there with them, hostage. They hold them at blaster point and threaten their lives if the commander doesn't acquiesce to their demands, let them in, facilitate the transfer of all those credits, and ensure their safe departure. So you've got not just a possible example of perfidious conduct, but you also have that element of hostage taking as well, and that threat of violence and murder to exact the ends that you're trying to achieve in your mission. So Michelle and Tracy mentioned perfidy, and I just pulled Article 37 from Additional Protocol 1. Recognize that this is pertains to an international armed conflict. We're just going to apply it here. AP2 has, at least in the draft form, had a definition of perfidy, but it exists in these various forms. But at the core of it is that text in red. And it's that intention to betray confidence that you help to manifest, that you help to engender by taking actions that would invite that confidence. So taking up some, say wearing the Red Cross emblem, pretending to be a medic and or a non-combatant like a chaplain, or in this case, wearing the enemy uniform. Now, wearing an enemy uniform doesn't afford you protection, right? It just lulls the enemy into a sense of complacency. And indeed, in IHL, at various points in the past, the business of wearing the enemy's uniform to conduct different operations has long been a tension point. You can go back as even to the Lieber Code in the US Civil War and see mention of the business of perfidy as it relates to wearing the enemy's uniform. And so what we're concerned with here is that idea of treachery, because not all wearing of an enemy uniform is unlawful. And in fact, IHL talks about the improper use of an enemy uniform. So that suggests that there is a proper use for an enemy uniform. And really, just distilling it down into really simple terms, the dividing line seems to be right along the use of violence, right? The moment that you start using that uniform to lull and engender that confidence in order to kill or injure or otherwise destroy the enemy, that starts to get you into the realm of treachery and into the realm, therefore, of perfidy. So here you have, I would argue, an element of violence there. So they've obviously used force as they get into the front end of this facility. They actually shoot an Imperial colonel who's seen there on the left, a visiting engineer from Coruscant. They kill him, and then while they don't hit or shoot the wife or the child, they use the explicit threat of violence against those two. They end up getting into a shootout in the area of the vault. Several Imperials die, and during their escape, several TIE fighters are destroyed. Their pilots killed during that escape. So people die, people are injured during the course of this infiltrations team's use of the uniform. And it struck me as, Michelle, you were talking, this business or the concept of survival. And this is that survival mentality sort of encapsulated here. You have a rebel group, a rebel movement, a nascent one, that is up against it. They don't have resources. They don't have means. This infiltration group is armed only with just really light explosives and light small arms. They don't have air support. There's no capital ships coming to their rescue, no legion of rebel troops, no Han Solo or Chewbacca flying in to save the day. It's just these seven and what they can achieve here. And their objective is a really critical one. It is, I think, quite possibly a linchpin for the survival or the continued existence or building of the Rebel Alliance. If that movement is to continue and to have any chance against the Galactic Empire, this mission has to succeed. They have no other way to get this kind of funding. And so there is a mechanism of survival that impacts or influences their decision to not just wear the uniform, but to conduct this mission in the way that it's done. But you see this interesting thread that even with this survival motivation, the business of taking those two hostages is very nearly a step too far, even for this group. There's a sense of sort of shock as Vel, the leader of this group, takes the two hostages and threatens to kill them. It doesn't derail the mission, but you sense this tension point within the crew there that, hey, this is not what we signed up for. And so this is far from the only example of possibly perfidious conduct in Star Wars. In fact, a huge chunk of A New Hope revolves around Han and Luke wearing Imperial Stormtrooper outfits to get onto the Death Star and rescue Leia. So this is something that exists over and over again. But the important point here, and one that I think carries over into Star Trek, especially when you get into the business of these sort of enemy races or enemy species that are perceived to only conduct war, the Cardassians, the Klingons, etc., whose society sort of exists to war with the human race. So too do you have that tension point here. The Rebel Alliance is up against a formidable enemy, an enemy that does not wear gloves as they fight, an enemy that has no compunction about murdering, torturing, and doing all manner of bad things to you, to anyone, because as Cassian said, you mean nothing to them. They don't have to learn these rules. They don't have to play by them. But I would submit to you that it is critical for the Rebel Alliance to do that. And it's not critical to gain influence in the Senate or change the minds of some powerful voting bloc or something like that. But it matters from a fundamental moral standpoint. So the underpinning of the entire rule of law, as it were, and certainly of IHL, is this business of humanity, this business of abiding by a set of rules that are essential to balance out, or that to put that concept of military necessity into balance, so that total war and the business of subjecting anyone and everyone under the sun to violence, to death, to injury is a thing of the past, that it's that we may not eliminate armed conflict as a whole, as a practice, but we may bring it into some semblance of balance in which humanity can be preserved. And so in the Star Wars context, it matters to people like the Dani, these civilians, these indigenous peoples there on Aldhani. They don't know the Rebel Alliance from anybody, but they know the boot heel that they've been under with the Galactic Empire. It matters to the folks on Ferrix, the other planet that's prominently featured in Andor, another planet that's sort of brutally occupied by the Empire, and one where civilians are regularly killed and injured, tortured by Imperial forces there. It matters to Cassian, to the Kenari tribe where he came from, that experienced sort of the very origins of imperial authoritarianism and brutalism. And it matters in the context of A New Hope to members of the galaxy, to places like Alderaan, even sort of very wealthy first world type, in the Star Wars sense, first world type planets that are used to having a lot of influence and are often far from any types of armed conflict. So it matters to the people of the galaxy because the Rebel Alliance is not just a movement to throw off the yoke of oppression. It's a movement to restore the rule of law to the galaxy. And if they achieve that end by any means necessary, by fighting just the same as the Empire does, not only do you plant the seeds for your own eventual collapse in terms of your eventual governing body, but you engender no confidence in the people. You are replacing, in the eyes of, say, the Aldani or the Ferrix people, you're replacing one brutal ruler for another. You're swapping out insignia, you're swapping out personnel, but at the core, that adherence to the rule of law is still gone. And that's why IHL matters. That's why these concepts of like perfidy really matter, because even in the face of daunting odds and in the face of those sort of survival instincts that might compel you to take the gloves off and justify fighting by any means necessary, there is still a critical importance to abide by IHL and to, in the absence of, say, international treaties or intergalactic treaties, develop that sort of state practice that forms the basis for the eventual restoration or creation of a body, at least in Star Wars, that resembles IHL. Tracy, I went way over my time. I apologize, but thanks for letting me detour everyone into the galaxy far, far away.
Thomas, that was spectacular. Thank you so much for sharing both your love of Star Wars and your insights. And I will say that I am looking forward to my issued lightsaber, but only if I get to have a Lothcat like Sabine Wren, because I have my standards.
Look, if I'm wearing stars by that point, which is highly unlikely, I will allow it.
Well, I appreciate that. I think what you and Michelle have both done an amazing job of is highlighting the commonalities between our two universes here, because we've talked about Utopia and we've talked about Empire, and a commonality there is individual people who are infusing their actions in a wartime environment with ethical and moral principles that could eventually develop into the foundations for law. And I think that's really fascinating, because it seems like, to me, just Tracy Reynolds' opinion, that states commit to laws whenever they engage in a treaty obligation with another state, and everybody recognizes that as law. States write law for their own citizens and hold their own citizens responsible if those citizens violate the laws to which they're bound. But it's human beings that abide by law. It was Abraham Lincoln that issued General Order 1, which became the Lieber Code, which infused throughout the Civil War one of an incredibly brutal conflict, of Americans on Americans, with principles that are recognized now as being laws of armed conflict and are still reflective of the principles that the Navy fights under. Honor, courage, and commitment, our guiding principles, aren't law, but the Department of Defense has infused the principle of honor throughout our application of legal requirements when we're in any type of conflict. We've made that decision by policy. And I think that's really fascinating, because whether there's an empire or whether there's a utopia in the new outer space legal regime that we're working on right now, there's still going to be humans that are going to be making decisions. And I think what we've kind of drawn a line from our first conversation in episode 1 of this particular series was talking about kind of the defensive posture and offensive posture, that's that tension and conflict that Star Wars has. with this exploration scientific mindset that Utopia has of Star Wars. But what we've seen in the episode today, is that perfidy is something that under the laws we have now, we can anticipate and apply through these vignettes that you've both talked about. I'd like to also mention that there is a Q&A button. We do have a couple of participants on the call, so if anybody wants to jump in, I hope that for the next few minutes we can just kind of talk, because it sounds like Thomas, I'm really curious, how you would see somebody that abides by Jedi principles, that thinks of the Force as kind of a unifying energy and moral foundation in the universe, especially with, we just saw Ahsoka's finale last week. I don't know if you saw it, but the statues in the back behind Balin's skull, what is that? Can you speak to that a little bit and how that might serve as a moral foundation for the Star Wars universe?
Yeah, that's probably a question that could take its own presentation or its own chapter, I guess. And it's a fascinating one. So the Force, this binding force, or that little f force that connects the universe, as Obi-Wan and Yoda teach us, is wielded by man, right? It's wielded by beings, and so the Force itself seems to have this anchor point in some semblance of morals. I mean, we see that in Rogue One, where there's that great scene where they have to flip this master switch to be able to transmit the Death Star plans from the surface of Scarif up to the Rebel fleet, and Chirrut Imwe, so the blind Donnie Yen, played fantastically.
He was so great, wasn't he? So great.
He was fantastic, but he's walking through this hail of blaster fire, seemingly protected by the Force, right? There's no, and some of the Empire's, most elite troops are the ones shooting at him, not folks that are prone to miss like normal stormtroopers. And he does that, and immediately after throwing the switch, he's killed, right? So we see these instances, or maybe when Luke is able to fire the proton torpedoes down the Death Star's exhaust port. The Force seems to have this will of its own, and that the will of the Force is sort of talked about in some context. But at the end of the day, it's wielded by beings, and beings can do what they want with it. And you see corruption, the corruptive use of that power through the Emperor, Darth Vader, etc. And it's not like the Force is rebelling against them and preventing them from doing the bad things that they're doing. But it's also, it can be sort of fumbled around with in the same way that the Jedi Order, I think, arguably does. So we like to think of the Jedi Order as this great magnanimous body, but within, I don't know, minutes of hostages being taken on Geonosis and Attack of the Clones, they just decide that they're no longer peacekeepers. They're about to be, military commanders, and they take charge of this new clone army, and without blinking an eye, go in and fight a 4-year-long war. And so I think we'll see as Ahsoka continues, maybe some of those lines get colored in about the Force and what it means for it to have its own sort of ideas about things. But it always comes back to people for me. And so that's why it's so critical that that moral underpinning, or that moral compass, whether you're a Force user or just a Starfleet admiral or a red shirter on a mission, that everyone be instilled with that moral compass that's going to guide how you act in any given situation.
I think that's very insightful. And I'd like to follow up your comments with a question to Michelle. Captain Picard, iconic, has been tortured, still abided by his values. Just like the folks in the Christmas truce in World War II, has just made decisions on the scene in wartime, or what we would conceive as wartime, to find that thread of humanity. Now, he's fictional, obviously, but I think in my legal practice, I have definitely seen the prophylactic effects of ethical rules and good order and discipline, and how they can help people to be the best version of themselves in terrible circumstances. Now, Michelle, among her many accolades, has co-founded an entity that has a view on ethics in outer space, and also with her interest in Captain Picard, I was wondering if she could talk just a little bit about For All Moonkind, the ethics as a foundation for law, or really take it in whatever direction you like, Michelle. I mean, your brilliance knows no bounds, so don't let me cut you off with an inartful question. So, Michelle, if you could please speak to that. Thank you.
After that, whatever I say is going to sound really dumb. So I'm just going to go for it. I'm gonna sort of suggest an unpopular thought that came as I was watching this amazing presentation. I've not delved into the Star Wars universe beyond the original episodes, basically, and then the last ones. But I would argue that the utopia presented is in Star Wars, not in Star Trek, because what we have in Star Wars is good and evil, and it's clear and right up front. It's very easy to decide who's right and who's wrong. Whereas Star Trek, we have a lot more blurry lines. Certainly, and I've not seen any of the TV shows and so forth, but to me, Star Wars is the triumph of good over evil, and Star Trek spends a lot more time sort of delving into the concept of the human character and the good and evil in that, and as we spoke in the run up to this, where AI fits in that, bringing data in was brilliant in terms of thinking about what we're facing today. But I think the question of ethics is one that we're really struggling with. We do have a Institute on Space Law and Ethics that we just stood up back in March, and the biggest question is really, what are ethics? And ethics are constantly evolving. When we think about even the laws of war and things that happen, our considerable understanding of ourselves continues to change, and our understanding of what is right and what is wrong also sort of evolves and changes. And so I think it's really fascinating to think about, Picard, this sort of, I guess in a way, he is sort of, as heroes are, somebody who can do no wrong, and he's got his flaws, but he always overcomes them. And I think it's unfair, as some fictions often are, because I don't know, are there real Picards out there? I'd like to think so. I'm sure that we can go through history and identify them, people who have made a difference, but nobody's perfect, and people make bad decisions all the time, and we're coming to grips with that here in the United States, right? With the movement to sort of change all the names of the army bases because they were named after people that we realized were ethically flawed, or had views that were ethically flawed by our standard of ethics today. Let me change that, by any standard of ethics. I think that's the most fascinating part, and when I think about the law of armed conflict and this concept of perfidy, I'll be honest, I didn't have the depth of knowledge that I just gained today, because to me, like Han Solo and Luke Skywalker, when they put on the stormtroopers, it was brilliant. Never even occurred to me that it would be a violation of LOAC or anything, and so it's the science fiction is perhaps wears rosier colored glasses than I do in my usual view of space and space law.
Now, I appreciate your insights, Michelle, and I think that we are challenged to look at history to see where our Captain Picards are. And I would mention Ernest Shackleton. He 2 years lived with the crew of the Endurance in the Arctic, and then they walked out. The intestinal fortitude that takes is beyond comprehension to me. And I think one of the great things about humanity is, in general, we can rise above. But then also, in general, we can sink to depravities that are atrocious. And that's, in my view, why we have legal systems that I mean, I think we did it. What was really fun for me today was talking through some of the legal theory, even though we weren't using words like realist or jurisprudential vices analytical legal foundations or natural law. But what we were talking about was what is organic to beings, folks with sentience who have a vested interest in their own survival. Like what about that manifests through social interactions into ethics or law or treaties or whatever. And then what do we actually do when bad things happen? And it's wonderful to read a book or watch a TV show because probably everything's going to be okay. Or if something terrible happens, it wasn't real anyway. But history is here for us to learn from. And the brilliant minds that have come up with these great stories can be leveraged so that hopefully we can have good decision making. As we talked about last time and this time, I mean, the outer space is here and it's time to think about it. And let's make witting choices where we're the best versions of ourselves instead of repeating mistakes, or at least make new mistakes, right? But we're at 1 o'clock. So thank you so much for your time today. And hopefully we can continue working together on this project because I think there's value here. And I definitely learned from you both. And now I have to go watch Andor because I haven't had a chance to watch that yet. And I can't wait. I loved, what was it? Rogue One was the movie. I loved that. I remember watching it in the theater in 2016. And I'm always up for a Voyager episode. So
expect a full report from both of you.
Well, this is great. And so thank you so much for your time. And so this is the Space Law Interest Group, episode 2, Do Klingons Follow the Geneva Conventions? Thanks to the American Society of International Law for all the technical support today. And we are signing off.
Thank you.